Welcome to the New York Business Leaders Podcast, presented by the Coyle Group. We interview the most interesting and influential business leaders in New York and hear their stories of success, challenges, and lessons learned while building their businesses and personal brands. New episodes drop weekly, so please be sure to subscribe to get updates on your favorite stream. Without further delay, here's your host of the New York Business Leaders Podcast, Gordon Coyle.
Welcome back to the show. In this week's episode of the New York Business Leaders Podcast, I speak with Charles Bernard, the founder and CEO of Criteria for Success, a sales coaching and consulting firm focused on helping salespeople sell more. This is a great conversation that touches on what I'd call a more modern selling strategy, which creates opportunities through a salesperson's subject matter expertise versus the more traditional brute force methodology. Charles talks about his firm's sales playbook process and why sales organizations need a prescribed process for success. I think organizations of any size with salespeople will find this conversation interesting and worth a listen. Without further delay, let's join the conversation with Charles. All right, welcome back to the show, everyone. My name is Gordon Coyle. I'm the principal of the Coyle Group, and today I've got with me Charles Bernard, who is the founder and CEO of Criteria for Success, which is a sales coaching and management company. Charles, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Gordon.
Glad you could join us. So why don't you give us a short thumbnail of what Criteria for Success is and what you guys do?
Yeah, fine. So we describe ourselves as a sales growth partner. What that essentially means is that we work with organizations, all shapes and sizes and industries, mostly in a B2B world. And we partner with them to grow revenue, profit, and best practices in sales and actually leadership as well, because that's a big part of what we do.
Great. Now, we've had conversations in the past. I know that you're really big on something called a playbook. Can you give me a little insight into what that is?
Sure. So that's a fancy term for a sales process. And what I mean by that is a visible, documented, you hire someone new, they come into the organization and they're given the sales playbook or they're asked to look through the sales playbook. So my definition of a sales playbook, I guess the easiest way to say it is it's simply a well-organized, documented set of best practices in your organization that you want people to be aware of, follow, and in many cases enhance as business evolves. That's it in a nutshell.
Okay. And I would imagine that's so that every new salesperson, the whole process is repeatable and duplicatable.
Yeah, you're looking for some consistency. If you've been in business for a while, you don't have to have been in business for a long time. But if you've been doing whatever you've been doing, you kind of start to recognize that there are certain things that work and other things that don't work. So the things you want to be doing is really capturing what's working and what works across the team so that you can discuss it, make people aware of it. And as you said, this really is very valuable for new hires in particular.
And could you transport the same playbook from a financial services firm to an industrial firm?
That's a really good question. So every playbook gets nuanced, but because we've been doing this for a while, Gordon, we've come to distill it into 5 best practice areas. So there's a practice for generating leads. We call that prospecting. There's a practice for converting those leads to opportunities. We call that selling. We always see those two in every sales process. The third area that we think is a little unique, but does apply to every organization, regardless of industry, is support. And that would mean a documented way in your playbook of helping others in the organization outside of sales support sales. So that could be marketing, could be operations, could be other entities that contribute to the selling process. The third area is system. Most every organization, again, regardless of industry, needs a CRM like a Salesforce.com. And one of the big issues we hear is we've spent $1 million implementing this wonderful tool that no one's using. So a playbook helps people understand how to get the most out of their CRM. So we call that the system section. And then the last section, again, this applies across the board, is what we call team. And it allows people on the sales team as well as outside of the sales team to contribute ideas, success stories, questions, comments, forums. The Playbook is a dynamic platform. We use something called a wiki based platform, and it's on the cloud. So it's easy to access. It's on the internet. You don't have to be in a particular location. And because it's a wiki and it's like Wikipedia, it's based on that technology. Anyone who has the ability and the rights to access and change content can very quickly say, hey, I got an idea. Let's share this. I'm going out on a call to an insurance company. Anyone got a proposal that I can look at or a marketing deck that I could borrow? So there is this whole dynamic around being able to enhance the playbook. And again, because that's a pretty fluid structure, it applies to any organization.
Interesting. So who is the typical client for you? How many salespeople do they have? The size of the organization? Give us a sense of that.
People ask that, and the organization we like to work with ideally is companies who have a sales team of 10 or more. And it will certainly work with companies that have slightly smaller teams, and obviously companies that have much larger teams. But 10 seems to be a good threshold, because one of the things that we do when we're working with clients, Gordon, is we look at some of the performance. So we stack rank performance across a team, and we look at typically what the top 20%, because that's usually the number of the sales team is doing, to be able to kind of distill that secret sauce and help others who are close, they're not quite there, or they need some help to be able to learn from those best practices. So 10 is a good number to get people to share with each other and isolate some of those top performers. When the team's like 1 or 2 people, it's kind of difficult to really distinguish great performance from mediocre performance. That's kind of why we look at that number.
Okay. 10 salespeople.
10 salespeople or more. Now, the interesting part is that when you've got an organization of 10 salespeople, you've probably got a pretty sophisticated operations team. You've got another team in marketing. You've got another team that might be, if you're a technical company, providing project management. If you're a wealth management company, it might be client advisors. And so some of those people wouldn't consider themselves as salespeople, but they have a lot of client or customer interaction. So they oftentimes benefit from the training we do that is around the sales playbook as well.
Great. Talking about sales leadership and kind of the new school thinking of things that are going on in that area, what's your take on the best way to grow sales? You know, you talked about it in the very beginning of what your 5-step process is, you know, prospecting. If you talk to any salesperson, prospecting is probably where they get jammed up the most.
Sure.
Where do you see like things today between digital, face-to-face, especially after the pandemic and Zoom and everything that's going on around us? What's your current thinking on how to grow sales effectively, as well as salespeople?
Yeah, nice thinking. So I think the new school is, first off, you want to get away from what I call lone wolf leadership, which is something that I see a lot. And that is, you got a VP of sales, a head of sales, who's accountable and responsible for growing sales. And the problem with that is that I think there are many other parts of the organization, as I had said before, that can really help build some level of accountability and participation with the sales leader. So what am I saying? I'm basically saying that one thing that we're seeing and advocating for in the new way of selling or leading sales is to form a sales growth team. So if you looked at the 5 functions of our, or the 5 areas of our sales playbook process, it's a good idea to have those functions represented on a sales growth team. So now a team right across the entire organization, marketing, sales, human resources, finance, operations, are all participating together to enable salespeople to be more successful. And the reason I think that is important is because of my second point. And the second point is that something, again, that I'm seeing, you mentioned prospecting. I think there's a big controversy right now around what is hunting. You go into an organization and people are saying, I want to hire a hunter salesperson. My salespeople aren't hunting anymore or as much as I'd like. I think we're kind of stuck in an old paradigm versus a new paradigm of hunting. Old paradigm is you do a lot of outreach, you call people, you send them emails, you go through their LinkedIn profiles, you go through your LinkedIn profiles. A lot of heavy lifting and a lot of fruitless activity. Why? Because I think today in the 21st century in 2021, buyers are conditioned to ignore that behavior. So the question becomes is how do you as a seller penetrate all these like fortress walls that are being put up to prevent you from getting through? And I think you got to ask yourself, what can we do with our salespeople that gets buyers interested in talking to them? And so new school thinking, I think, is you got to invest in really turning your salespeople into subject matter experts. Now, that's something I notice in certain industries more than others. You kind of talked about financial. So I think in the financial, let's say a wealth management company, you'll often find that the client managers are subject matter experts because they're literally taking their client portfolios and their money from their client, and they're actually making the investments for them. So they know what they're doing there, but they also are being asked by their leadership to go out and prospect. And so applying that old school, I think is going to make them get very frustrated very quickly. But if on the other hand, they do events, roundtables, webinars, and they really get to showcase their knowledge. And this doesn't have to be in the financial industry. This could be any industry. If you as a salesperson can showcase your knowledge when you're following up to people who attended at that meeting, they're more likely to, number one, remember that you knew what you're talking about. And number two, they'll take your phone call because they may have follow-up questions. As opposed to what I see oftentimes is you put this big subject matter expert who leads the event, and you've got these kind of salespeople on the sidelines that get introduced. This is Charles from the sales team. Say hi, Charles. Hi. And now Charles is supposed to follow up with that person who attended, one of the buyers who attended, and they can barely remember that I was even there. They'll obviously remember the subject matter expert. So what am I saying? Bottom line is you really got to help your salespeople know what they're talking about so they can field a lot of valuable questions and frankly, make it worthwhile for a buyer to want to talk to them.
That's really interesting. Being in the insurance business and being directly responsible for sales, I totally understand where you're coming from. And it's a paradigm that I think my business is kind of, distracted by. And it's interesting that we use the term new school and old school. I would be considered like part of the old school because of my age, but I think my thinking is more new school. At least I'd like to think that. But a lot of folks my age, especially some of the older guys in the business, they think that the perfect insurance salesperson is the one that goes out and hunts and prospects incessantly and collects what we call X dates, which are the expiration of somebody's insurance policy. And they go through this traditional process. And then they question, why can't I get an appointment? Why can't I get to second base? And if I get to second or third base, why can't I close a deal? Why is there so much resistance? And it's it's like a push-pull theory. Like you can push yourself into a client or you can pull clients towards you. So I really appreciate that kind of thought process that the new school is let me demonstrate my expertise and hopefully inbound business will come to me. If it does, then I'll have a system or a playbook to bring that business in, cultivate it, nurture it, ultimately close it. And it's also interesting that you bring up a wealth management firm. I spoke to a pretty well-known firm in the city yesterday, independent, small boutique firm, and their marketing folks. I had a conversation with them, and the principals of the firm do a lot of content development and media, and they're getting on CNBC. They're being featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. So, that whole subject matter expertise is incredibly valuable, I think, as a linchpin to closing deals today.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said. And I'll add to what you just said, because when you mentioned that you've been doing this for a while, some people view that as, I'm sort of thinking more old school. I don't necessarily agree with that. I kind of agree with your logic, which is actually I can use that expertise to pivot to some of the ways selling is changing. And it's how you apply that expertise that matters, I think, in the new school, right? It's like you meet with someone, and I think there are two kinds of salespeople. There's the salesperson who wants to bring all that knowledge and overwhelm the buyer by basically telling them what they know. And the buyer's like, I don't care about half of what you just said, because that doesn't seem to address my need. And then there's the other that holds back on that knowledge and gets really good at one other skill that I think is important to develop on a sales team. And that is being able to ask the right thoughtful questions and show up in a buying conversation where the buyer trusts you enough to tell you what they care about. And most often what buyers care about are their problems. And I think one of the things that distinguishes kind of great salespeople from mediocre salespeople is the ability to, number one, gather those problems, make it comfortable for people to trust you, to tell you what they really care about, not just throw your bone with a casual problem, but like a real one that I've been struggling with for a while, maybe. And then the ability for that salesperson like you, who have all that experience, to be able to give people some value right away, whether they buy or they don't, that indicates some new thinking on their part, like, oh, I hadn't thought about that, or that's an interesting viewpoint. Can we talk more about that? In other words, letting the buyer discover your value versus you hitting them over the head with your value. Yeah. I think that that's really a skill, honestly.
Yeah, that's the sharing of knowledge that's focused on what may be particularly bothering that person, rather than, I kind of say that telling is not selling.
Right. Yes.
And I'm sure somebody else coined that phrase that I just hijacked. So
great phrase.
Where did you kind of come up with the methodology, the philosophy behind this process you've developed?
So it's a combination of what I call philosophy and mechanics. So I used to be, back in the day, a data processing guy. I was a software engineer, then a systems analyst, and I was very fortunate, at least I think so, in working for an outstanding company that brought me over from the UK. That's where I started my career. And I was recruited to join a company that was purchased by General Electric. So I became a GE employee. And I got a ton of management training, leadership training. And through a long story that I won't bother you or your listeners with, I was asked to run a project by a client that was a very big outsourced IT project. So I went from being a technical person implementing some of these technologies to actually running the project. And I soon learned that General Electric's idea of running a project was not only managing the people, but increasing the footprint. within the organization. In other words, what more value can we add? What other projects could we uncover? So in a way, I sort of fell into sales through that process. So to answer your question, I think a lot of what I practice today in terms of methodology is what I learned at places like General Electric. When I left GE, I started my own company. And again, I founded this company, which is the third company that I founded, and it's focused on sales training. And prior to that, I was a sales trainer working for Sandler. Some people may be familiar with Sandler Systems,
Sure.
which I think is a great foundation. It really gave me an appreciation of what a real professional salesperson should go through, and a real appreciation for the dynamics between a buyer and a seller, because Sandler has this great way of looking at both sides. Mm-hmm. And so I learned a lot of stuff there. And then with the Playbook, because it's got a big technology component, I was able to leverage some of my technical expertise, because I do think that in addition to selling being an art, it's also a science, right? Mm-hmm. I borrowed that term from somewhere, but there's a process and there's a step-by-step thing that makes sense. And so some of that is, or a lot of that is in the Playbook from my technical sense. I know that's a long-winded way of answering your question, but.
No, that's interesting. So the technical side of it sort of leads me into my next question, and that is how does a business owner who hires you or anybody in sales development and training, like what metrics can they use to know this has been a success, that this is working?
Yeah, that's a question that almost every client that hires us asks us. Like, how are we going to know if we pay all this money, what our return is?
Right.
So you would think that my standard response is that we're going to increase revenue, right? Now, the problem with that is, by doing this many years, is you begin to realize when you're a person like me in an organization like ours, that that's not necessarily within your control, within our control. So an example is, you can get a bluebird, someone will call you tomorrow and say, I'm hiring you, and you get a nice big win, or you get a referral and you land a big deal. And no sales training got in the middle of that. And conversely, you can lose a client. Like, it might take you a year to build a relationship. It might take you 5 seconds to lose it, right? So it's very volatile, and we don't really have a lot of control over that. Where we like to promise key performance indicators is in the ability to generate more opportunities and improve your conversion ratio. So in other words, if we have a sales team of 10 that on average per month closes 20 deals, let's say, we want to get that closed number higher, 25. Now, how do we do that? Well, we want them to increase their number of deals, their deal volume. And you might be surprised to hear that one lesson we've learned: if you want to increase your deal volume, you've also got to increase your disqualification of the deals you're not going to win. So in other words, one thing we notice a lot of the time is that salespeople are chasing deals they're not likely to win. And the sooner you can let go of a deal that's not going to close, the sooner your manager or your leader can say, you know what, I don't think this is going to be a good deal for us, the more you can spend on the deals you are going to close. So that implies a spike in volume, quality deals, right? And then if you're closing, let's say 1 in 10, we'd like you to close 1 in 5. And I think we can, with our approach, help you shorten the sales cycle, which obviously allows you to close more deals in a quicker period of time.
So in my world, we'd call that pipeline management.
Pipeline management, yes. Big important part. Absolutely. You nailed it.
How do you build into the training process getting people to understand what a qualified lead is and what a qualified lead isn't?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of criteria, but I would say people are very good at putting numbers to that criteria of what's a qualified deal and what's not. But I also think, and you can certainly say if they have this much money or if they're this kind of a company with this kind of a profile, they're qualified. I think that's relatively easy. I would call that the mechanical approach, right? It's very visible, very metric driven, and you can script that out for your salespeople to follow without really much thought. The harder part of qualifying a deal is what I would call the philosophical relationship part. Like, what are the indicators that we're a good cultural fit? Now, that's not always going to be the case because some people are looking at volume and transactions. But in a B2B sale, what we call a consultative sale, I think relationship plays a big part of it. And therefore, if you buy that concept that relationship is almost as important as demographics, you got to help people understand what makes a good indicator for a good relationship so you can qualify as a good deal. And I would say certain things like, are we a cultural fit? The other thing that I think is really important, especially for companies like me that provide a lot of service, and maybe companies like you that does the same, is the client or the customer equipped internally to make the most out of what you're providing? So for us, oftentimes money's not a barrier. So we'll go into an organization, they're like, come on in, we'll pay you whatever you want. But we got to kind of say, well, let's make sure we make sense that we're a good fit for you. Do you have a head of sales? No. Do you have people who are willing to spend the time to work with us to customize the sales playbook? No. Aren't you going to do it all and like wave your magic wand and get it all done? Unfortunately, we'd love to do that, but there's a certain amount of heavy lifting required on the client side that if that's not present, they're not a qualified opportunity.
Right.
So I don't know if you agree with that, but I think, we often ignore that relationship side, and I think it's really important.
Yeah. In my world of insurance and in business insurance, kind of like thinking along the lines of cultural, are you developing a relationship that's based on the value that you bring to the transaction? Or is the client purely looking at it from a transactional perspective? Right. If it's a price-driven sale, they're not really looking at all of the extra value add-ins that you're going to bring to the table. If that's the case, it's time to pack your bags and go home.
Yes.
Unfortunately, that kind of goes back to the conversation we had earlier about new school and old school. So many of my peers would rather just say, I'm gonna still work on this. I'm gonna bring this guy a great deal. I'm gonna close this deal. And then there's a lot of stuff in the background that they're not understanding about the relationship with the current broker, where there's an incumbent relationship that you've got to break or wedge into in order to win the sale. Somebody has to lose. And if you don't think that person is going to lose, you're not going to win. So it's interesting.
Yeah. And I'll add something there, Gordon, because you reminded me of, I think, another indicator of a good relationship, particularly during the buying process, is the quality and frequency of feedback. Because if I had to say, probably the number one source of suffering for every salesperson that I've spoken to in a service sale is radio silence. It's like, I had this great meeting. We had this wonderful Zoom call. The prospect said, bring it on, send your proposal over, love this. And then we do that, we email it and we hear nothing. And then we chase them and we hear nothing. But even an active client, again, I usually find one indicator of the healthiness of the relationship is the quality of the feedback. Like, are they giving me straight feedback? Like what they're happy with, what they're not happy with? Do they feel comfortable enough to say that? And will they allow me to give them feedback? Like, the project's getting stalled because we have a roadblock in your organization, or something happened that we aren't able to take care of, but we're just telling you that, giving you straight feedback, or someone's not carrying their weight, that's straight feedback. So I think that to me is a big indicator. Now, whether it disqualifies you completely from a deal, I think you determine that. But I think it's important to measure those things that oftentimes we don't think about measuring, like quality and frequency of feedback.
Yeah, I think that also goes to the maturity not necessarily age-wise, but just the maturity of the salesperson. Are they self-confident enough to ask those questions, to receive that kind of feedback, to give feedback to their prospect? How are we doing here? How do you feel about our progress? Most salespeople don't want to rock the boat and possibly like blow an opportunity, so they don't ask those questions. But the more mature person, at least in my experience, is the one that's willing to put themselves out there, to be vulnerable, to ask the questions, to get that valuable feedback, to know where they are. And again, is it a viable prospect, or are you 3/4 of the way through and this is never going to close because of some unknown factor that's not been brought to the surface because nobody's asked?
Absolutely. And therefore, back to the new school thinking, one of the things we do in our trainings is when you're a salesperson, if you make this small amount of effort, it can pay dividends. And what we mean is when you're developing a brand new relationship with a buyer, just let them know as early as possible. We have a core philosophy in our organization. So I'm the salesperson saying this. And one of those is when we work with new companies, hopefully we'll work together with a person like you, if you're talking to a prospect. One of our key philosophies is feedback. And I think that kind of causes the prospect or the buyer to kind of pause for a second. And usually they'll say, that's interesting. What do you mean? Well, timely feedback. We like to give it, we like to get it, positive, negative. Sometimes people ask us to submit a proposal, which we're very happy to do and honored to do. We only ask above everything else, whether you decide to move forward or not, that you let us know on a timely basis. Would that be good enough? And I've discovered, because I sort of track this with all our engagements, that better than 50%, I probably say it's maybe as high as 70% of the time that you ask for that up front, people will remember that you planted that seed, and they'll actually give you feedback. Whether it's the one you want to hear or not, that's different, but at least you hear, right? You're not
right.
Wondering where do you stand.
Right. The exchange of mutual covenants, I think, is part of that.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I could go on for hours. I want to be respectful of your time. I love talking sales strategies, techniques, methodologies, accountability, all of that. Before we go, I wanted to ask, do you have for the listeners, any recommendations on books, resources, podcasts, websites that you may be thinking of that could be helpful?
Well, I'll shamelessly plug my website because we have a ton of free resources and some podcasts.
Good.
And that's criteriaforsuccess.com. And there's actually a tab on resources that gives you access to free content. It's ebooks and stuff. And then there's insights, which is blogs and other content that might be helpful. So that's on our end. But I do have a couple of books that I've read that have really made a big impact, at least for me. One is from my Sandler days. You can't teach a kid how to ride a bicycle in a seminar. Yep. So it's like riding a bicycle requires. So there's a lot of good wisdom in there. You got to kind of learn balance. And that's kind of what I liked about a book for fundamental selling. And then one more recently, a couple of years ago, I read, which really blew me away, was a book by an author called Chris Voss. And he used to be a former FBI agent, and he dealt with hostage situations, bank robbers who had taken hostages, terrorists. I mean, this guy's the real deal.
Yeah.
And he learned how to negotiate with people like that, where your life really depends on it. And he wrote a book. And he translated a lot of those principles into business. So the title of the book is Never Split the Difference, Negotiate Like Your Life Depends on It. And that's, I think, a good read.
Yeah, I would agree on both those books. And with Chris Voss's book, you can also subscribe to his weekly, or I think it's a weekly newsletter that he emails. And the name of his company is the Black Swan Group, correct?
Yes. And he talks about what a black swan is in his book.
Yep. Fascinating stuff. His book was when he talked about bank robberies and that there was no real prescribed methodology to get hostages out of a situation. I thought to myself, I guess somebody had to create it, and he did. It was really fascinating.
Yeah.
Charles, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you today. Any last comments?
No, thank you for this opportunity to add hopefully some wisdom to your listeners. I appreciate you giving me this opportunity, and I wish you well.
Thank you. And if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
So my email is usually the best way, cbernard@criteriaforsuccess.com, all spelled out. That's usually the best way to get in touch with me.
It's been a great pleasure speaking with you today. I hope the listeners enjoyed the conversation. This is Gordon Coyle. The podcast is the New York Business Leaders Podcast. If you'd like to be featured on this show or know somebody who would be great for this content, let me know.
That's it for this week's episode of the New York Business Leaders Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode. In the meantime, find more interviews and resources at nybusinessleaders.com.